To open our second day summit, we have a panel of professionals who will share their unique perspectives on accommodation. This will be moderated by the amazing Wendy Porch. Our panelists today will be Rachel Boutin and Mike Kimmis. First of all, Wendy Porch is the Executive Director of the Center for Independent Living in Toronto. She has been working in the field of accessibility, disability, human rights, and education for more than 20 years and is a lifelong disability justice advocate. Before joining SILT, Wendy was manager of episodic disability initiatives at Realize. She is a member of the City of Toronto's Accessibility Advisory Committee and the Disability Justice Network of Ontario's Advisory Committee. Wendy is a proud mom to her son Jasper and works to raise awareness of the needs of parents with disabilities. Rachel has held various mandates in the federal public service since 2004 and is passionate about all the issues surrounding the creation of an inclusive and accessible workplace. She found her calling in bringing true diversity and inclusion to the forefront of everything she does. Rachel is the manager of accessibility at Statistics Canada. Diversity is what Rachel is looking for in her work. Environment and inclusion is what Rachel hopes her workplace will offer to all. And finally, Mike Kimmis. Michael is the Health and Wellness Program Coordinator and Assistant Director of the Income Security Division of the BC Teachers Federation. Prior to his current duties, he served as Director of the Income Security for 10 years. The BCTF Health and Wellness Program supports public school teachers returning to work due to an illness or disability. Prior to joining the BCTF, Michael taught senior math and science in British Columbia. Over to you, Wendy.
Thank you, Brian. And it's really great to be here. It's nice to see everybody. And I'm so pleased to be able to talk with Michael and Rachel about accommodations in the context of workplaces. So we are really pleased to be able to share with everybody some of the challenges I think that we've encountered, some of the successes that we have been able to witness, and how we have all been trying to work towards creating a culture of accommodation in our various workplaces. So the first person who will tell you about their experiences today is Rachel. So Rachel, I'll just pass over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. And hi, everybody. My name is Rachel Boutin. As you can see, I'm Francophone. I want to start by saying that, I have the real privilege of living on Mohawk unceded territory. I'm very touched by what the Mohawk have provided us as information and learning that, everybody has to be accepted for who they are and not for the different abilities they may have. So thank you for the Mohawk people to have highlighted that we're all worth it and we all bring something special to the table. So as you can see, I'm wearing right now a blue shirt with a black vest. I have, blondish hair with a lot of gray streak. So I'm talking to you from my living room right now. My pronouns are she, her. And as you know, Giselle was very open about talking about her different abilities. So I've been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2004. I've been doing my whole career with MS. So I know what episodic means. And hopefully I'll be able to bring you more information as to what StatCan and as a fact, the whole government is doing right now. So I was asked to speak a little bit about, the accommodation in our organization. So as many of you hopefully know that there's a new Accessible Canada Act that came into action in 2019. And this act, it's a policy, but as Gisette said, that policy will bring us in all the departments into action, as we have to provide different plans moving forward and on how we'll make the whole federal government and more so Statistic Canada fully accessible by end of 2040. So right now, to make sure that we are fully accessible and making sure that we know which type of accommodation we should be doing, we are doing a full sound system review of everything we're doing, including accommodation processes, recruitment processes, the employee journey processes. But, accommodation is more than just that. So we're also looking into the buildings, the communication we're doing, the policies, the programs, the whole environment to make sure that we are tackling all possible barriers for accessibility for all employees. So we're doing that right now, doing the mapping and evaluating. And we're doing that with consultation as well with people with lived experience. And I don't just mean me, we're talking to the person with disability committee, asking them what they think. We're doing consultation, survey for employees. And, as we are talking about accommodation, we're often talking more about people with different abilities. But, there's accommodation that comes for everybody. It could be a single parent, it could be someone coming from that just immigrate in the country. So accommodation is much more broader for us than having accommodation because of a disability. So we're looking into that. So this is one of the aspects. Furthermore, the government is currently working on an accessibility passport. So speaking about accommodation that is more workplace focused, we are currently drafting an accessibility passport. So this document will serve for all employees to state exactly what they need at one point they need it. And we're not talking about over here speaking about the reason why you need that accommodation, but more so what accommodation you need to better do your job. So this accessibility passport will be pushed throughout the government pretty soon, and StatCan is at the forefront of that as we're co-leading the development of that platform, electronic platform, where we will be able to put that information and for that to follow us throughout our career, whatever we go in the government. And for us not to have to explain again every time what type of accommodation they need should we start a new position. Of course, there's different barriers everywhere, and we're the federal government, so we're working very hard to bring down some of the barriers. Procurement, of course, is one of the barriers we may face everywhere. Well, for some places, it will be the amount for the procurement. For us at the government, it's often the way we go about doing it and not being able to buy anything we want or we need. So we're working on that. And we have a contract with the special organization within the government that provides electronic, all IT support for all new employees, so they can provide a specific mouse or a specific keyboard, a screen, and all those elements are provided to us or new employees by them. So they have a library, so we can go and have it very fast. So it's good for all new students. Of course, COVID has certain impacts, some of them positive and negative on making sure the employees is well suited and all the accommodation are provided. For some like me, I've always worked from home, so it didn't change anything. I have all everything that I need to work. But for some employee that had to face rejection when if they could work from home. I think to be, they are now, they demonstrated that it's possible to be effective working from home. And for them, it may have, as it did for me, change a little bit, about how one can progress and show after that, there's different ways of working, and the accommodation of working from home is now accepted mostly throughout the government. So as I said, there's many key contributors for the success of any accommodation processes or evaluation that we're doing at StatCan. Our Committee for Persons with Disability is has a really huge impact on our capacity to provide whatever support we need to do. We have an amazing champion, Tony Labillois. If you don't know him, follow him on LinkedIn. Is very well versed, is very nice, and will provide you with a lot of information moving forward. So that champion is good for us, for the committee, for the accessibility secretariat, but he's also good for the whole organization, as is demystifying that disability as he's living with a visual impairment, but is very high up in the hierarchy right now. So it shows that it's possible to thrive within StatCan, and the door is open for all different talents. And he got his accommodation as soon as he came in. So he was really able to provide a recommendation and perspective to new employees on that. Of course, we need the leadership. So at StatCan, we have great leadership. Sorry, I'm trying to find the acronym means what? Chief Statistician, CS, government acronyms, we love it. So the Chief Statistician is really on board with us as to everything we're doing. We have an equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy, as well as we are right now drafting our first multi-year plan for accessibility, and is supporting us on everything we're doing. So key contributor, of course, the law, the new law that passed, let's say forces the government to take actions on what we need to do. And I'm hoping, even though if you're not federally regulated, that you'll look into the law, because there may be some path for you that you, at your degree, that you may look into it and improve it upon your organization and make it more accessible, as it's good for everybody to do so. I'm pretty sure we spoke about that in that summit. So finally, I was asked to provide some recommendation moving forward on how employers can support an effective workplace accommodation. Well, my first would be, accommodation is for everybody. If you start by offering it to all and starting with what do you need to best do your job, whatever the person is that comes into the team, you'll be demystifying that, accommodation is just for those with disability, which is not the case. So having an inclusive workplace will really help people feel comfortable in providing that type of information. So we do promote that at StatCan. As well, what can we say? Accommodation, it's such, it doesn't cost that much. So should you need your bigger enterprise, you could always have sorry, I'm searching for my word in English, a centralized fund for accommodation. So, and maybe some contract for, let's say, some computer devices or sit-stands desk on all of that. So if you have a centralized budget on that, it will be easier for all manager to make sure that it doesn't touch their budget, but they'll be able to address that. So there's so many more things that we could do, but it depends on what everybody has in place right now and where they want to go. But I would say, leadership, everything starts there. So open your heart, talk about inclusion, talk about, be comfortable talking about your disability if you have one, and what that means for you and for your colleagues. And by seeing more and more people with disability thriving into the workplace, I think it's going to inspire people, and they'll see that some accommodation are not that bad, and it makes your organization grow. So I could talk a little bit more, Wendy, but I think Michael has a lot to say as well. So I'm going to pass the baton.
That's great. Thank you very much. I think it's really excellent for folks to hear specifically about your context too, which, as you've described, is the federal government. It's federally regulated. The new Accessible Canada Act applies. Big employer, lots of resources. I think that that's a very specific context too. I think you've also really pointed out the importance of champions, right? Having champions within the organization, and also seeing people with disabilities who are succeeding, who are moving up the ladder of leadership too, and the influence that they can play as well. So thank you very much for that. Michael, I'm going to pass over to you, but just to say that your context is a little bit different in terms of the work that you do, where you work, how you, and the tools that you have available to you to create a culture of accommodation. So I will hand it over to you, but we're really looking forward to hearing more about your particular context as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and very much appreciate being here. I want to acknowledge that I am on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and I'm very happy to work and play on their land and have their permission to do so. And obviously, as we move forward, when we talk about accommodation, we are talking about equity and inclusion, and those are very, very big issues at the Federation that we are dealing with on a regular basis to make sure that all of our members feel included in the work that they do and how they're treated as teachers and professionals. Just want to acknowledge also too a little bit of our own unique context at the BC Teachers Federation. We represent the 44,000 public school teachers of British Columbia. Those teachers participate in what is called the BCTF Salary Indemnity Plan, which is a long-term and short-term disability plan, which is self-funded by BCTF members, which is fairly unique, as often most of you would be in disability plans that are funded by your employers. In the education sector, we have a number of examples where teachers have chosen to self-fund those benefits. And it's actually made for a good situation for us because it allows us the ability to accommodate members on LTD and other pieces, maybe that wouldn't be done in private sector disability plans. Obviously, the challenges that exist for accommodations in our landscape are varied and often varied due to the size and nature of our employers. We have over 60 school districts in British Columbia that range greatly in size and resources. We can go to the largest school district in British Columbia, which is the Surrey School District, which employs close to 4,000 teachers, or close to 5,000 teachers. And then we have a number of school districts where we might have less than 100 teachers employed by the entire school district. And so the ability for our employers to accommodate members in those situations can vary between school district to school district. And that often presents a challenge to us. But again, we do our best to encourage employers as much as possible to do what they can and remind them of course, their legal obligations to ensure that they have a duty to do this, and that undue hardship is a very, very high bar and standard to meet. And as a result, we're very fortunate that most of our employers do their best to try and support our teachers. Another piece that has changed is just the employment opportunities of teachers over the last number of years. 4 or 5 years ago, it was very, very difficult often to get into certain, especially larger or more sought after school districts in terms of getting a teaching position. And over the last 4 or 5 years, that has changed significantly, where we have a lot more movement of teachers due to retirements and due to a number of other issues as well of trying to keep teachers in school district and in teaching. And it's unfortunate that many of our newer teachers struggle to stay in the profession. 1 in 5 teachers often think about leaving education in their first 5 years, and that trend is growing and continuing. So the landscape in which accommodations exist for our employers is very varied, and but again, we always encourage them to look for best case solutions to help support that employee, knowing that if you have an employee who feels supported and engaged by their employer and is willing to go that extra mile, that's an employee who's going to be willing to go the extra mile for their students and for their school district. And we see that time and time and again, where teachers, when they are accommodated, the joy and the that they bring to their work and to what they can do moving forward. We obviously accommodate a number of different disabilities or different situations when we're dealing with members. When we're dealing with episodic disorders, certainly mental health is at the top of the list. We would say that over half of our long-term disability claims relate to mental health disorders, but I would say 80 to 90, if not almost all of them, touch on some type of mental health issue. And we are very fortunate with teachers as well, is that there's often a very, very, very strong desire to be at work and stay at work. So where you may have issues of interpersonal conflict or other pieces that may prevent in certain employment situations members going back, the desire to be with students and to be with their colleagues is a very, very strong motivating factor for teachers. And that really helps us in terms of keeping teachers at school. Though with some of our teachers, it can also act as, it can be challenging sometimes. Because sometimes if they're dealing with a medical condition, which is preventing them from doing their job, sometimes they'll try to hang in there a little bit too long and they don't get the help or support that they need. And one of the things that we're very fortunate of is that we will, in our program, work with teachers who are at work, as well as teachers who are off of work. So, for example, we may have someone who's struggling in our program dealing with an episodic disorder that in a traditional insurance environment wouldn't be able to get assistance or support because they are actually physically at work. In our situation, we're going to help support that member because we know the value of keeping them in the workplace and keeping them supported. And that, I think, helps us in terms of not only from a long-term and short-term disability perspective in terms of members going off and having to be off longer, but it also helps us catch those situations maybe earlier and allow us to support those members moving forward. I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen, and most notably, it was something certainly we'd seen an increase of previous to this, but I've really noticed dramatically during the pandemic, unfortunately, is members who are dealing with substance use issues. And I think we're all familiar with what goes on in the media with substance use in our communities and the challenges that are faced. And unfortunately, teachers are not immune to those challenges either. And again, those can be very, very difficult accommodations. But I think we are seeing more and more employers who are taking more of a medical model approach to dealing with accommodations in substance use. Early on, we would often have to deal with issues of if the employer was aware of the substance use, of members having to sign last chance agreements and other pieces, so that if there was some type of slip or fall with respect to their mental health and they were starting to use again, that could cost them their career. And so we're seeing a more medically based approach to that. It's good to see employers getting support and understanding of how to support members who are dealing with addictions, because I would say they're some of the trickiest and hardest files to deal with. So in terms of some of the other work that we do, we've had our employers do some fairly amazing accommodations at times. We had a member who was dealing with a very physical issue a number of years ago, and the teacher was working in a very unique project situation. Their job was to work with a group of students to build a structure at the end of their year. So there were 20 of them, and they worked together and they built, I believe it was a house, but I actually can't remember at this time. And the project goal was to complete the house. Unfortunately, the teacher dealing with an episodic issue was having to leave for a period of time, but was able then to come back to the project a few months later. And but that member was also going to have to take time as well off of work in order to keep moving forward with their treatment and other pieces. And it was really an amazing project where the school district actually hired just another full-time teacher to take on that construction project, because it wasn't going to be feasible for one teacher to pop in and one teacher to pop out in those situations, due to the fact that you were building a structure that required sign-offs and all of that piece, but also from the medical issues faced by the member. It was such a tremendous example of dealing with an accommodation, and it's the one that's always stood out to me in terms of our employers. The other issue I'd like to touch on that often people don't raise when we talk about education is something that's very unique, which is voice dysfunction. And many of our members are facing issues with voice, and that can happen to teachers that are early on in their career, as well as to teachers later or ending their career. And so one of the things that we've been very proactive about is ensuring that we get members in to see speech and language pathologists or see voice specialists or others to begin working on how they can protect their voice. And one of the key components of that often is the purchasing and use of voice amplification systems in school districts. And in one school district, for example, here in the Lower Mainland, one of the things that they did was purchase voice amplification systems for all of their classrooms, which makes a huge sense because we have so many teachers that are coming in and out, and it's a way for teachers as they're getting started on their career to learn how to use the systems and not overuse their voice early on in their career. And the voice amplification systems are just a great tool in doing that. We often can struggle sometimes with purchasing voice amplification systems for some of our members in certain districts, because often they may have a certain type of voice amplification system, but that might not meet the needs of the member who is dealing with the voice issue. And so it may result in them having to do purchases. I would say the issue of equipment purchase is still a big issue at times in our districts. And sometimes the over-medicalization of some of the accommodations that are requested. It's unfortunate that when we have, for example, an ergonomic assessment that's done by an occupational therapist, we're now seeing school districts wanting to have a specialist or others sign off on the occupational recommendations, even though the occupational therapist is the person who is best able to assess and understand the needs of the member. So I think that's about all I have, but be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. So thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. And it is very interesting to hear about the work that you're doing in a different context. And all of us as employers and anybody working for an employer is very much trying to negotiate some challenging circumstances around accommodation that are connected to our context. And so what you're saying, I think, is very interesting in that some of the school districts are very small and have different capacities, and some of the bigger ones might have more demand in terms of accommodations too. I think what you're saying too about voice related requirements for accommodation, I think sometimes we don't also put together that different professions have different demands and can result in different requirements around accommodation as well. And I heard that loud and clear from your talk too. So I appreciate that very much. The complexity of accommodations for 44,000 teachers in BC as well, and the wide range of things that, you know, on one hand you called amazing accommodations, and you've given us a good example of that. And then on the other hand, talking about how you're seeing there being a kind of over medicalization of the process of accommodation, and what the impact is for your members of that happening as well. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Just as a reminder, we will have about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, for questions after everybody speaks. But if you do have questions now, you can certainly put them into the chat, and we will hang on to those and pose them to the panelists. And I also have some questions for you anyway, so once we get to that point. But thank you very much again, Michael and Rochelle. I really appreciate it. I wanted to speak a little bit about my context as an employer. So I think everybody heard my introduction, but I am an executive director. I'm the executive director of the Center for Independent Living in Toronto. And I used to work at Realize. So I actually did coordinate a number of the national projects around episodic disability before I moved to SILT. And, you know, one of the things that's really great about that is I've been able to take my understanding of episodic disability and try to apply it in the context of the work that I do now at SILT, which is has long been very focused on the needs of people with physical disabilities. So I've been able to benefit from, I mean, I loved working at Realize anyway, but I've been able to benefit from that knowledge and that experience and bring that into my new context. I also want to talk a little bit about just my context, and then talk about how we do accommodations at SILT and some recommendations for employers too. So one of the things I think that's interesting about SILT, the Center for Independent Living in Toronto, SILT is the short form. One of the interesting things about our context is that we are what's called a consumer-led organization. And so our organization is a little bit different from some disability-specific organizations in that we're mandated in terms of our bylaw that the majority of our board members have to be people with disabilities. The president of SILT and the vice president of SILT have to be disabled people. I am a person with a disability myself, with a physical disability. And many of the staff at SILT are also people with disabilities. And so we have built into, you know, sort of baked in, I guess you could say, into our structure that the voices of disabled people are important. And in fact, SILT as an independent living center, so again, my context is different. I think it's just important to highlight that. We're a small organization in terms of employees. We have about 30, but our organization is based on the independent living movement. And that movement says very clearly that the experts on what disabled folks need are disabled people ourselves. So we, pretty much everything that we do, we try to center the voices of disabled people. And it's very similar in the context of the work that we try to do around accommodations. So, but just to say that without a culture of accommodation, without really being conscious and working towards accommodations and making sure that everybody has space to request them and that there's flexibility around that, we in fact couldn't fulfill our mandate, because we really are required to have disabled people be there, show up, be able to work, and have their voices heard. And accommodation is a really big part of that. So in terms of providing accommodations at SILT, we think it's an integral part of what we do. And it's not just for staff, but we have the same obligations as employers, as all of you do, around providing opportunities for people with disabilities to be accommodated. But we also have a wide range of folks that we work with in the community who also need to be accommodated in the context of participating in anything that we do. So it's integral. It is required for us to meet our mandate. We also accommodate board members. We have volunteers that are accommodated. Staff and students are all amongst the categories of people that we provide accommodations for. The accommodation process at SILT is really, we have formal elements of it and informal elements. So in the pre-COVID days, if you walked into our office, you would know that we are an employer who takes accommodating people with disabilities seriously, because you can see in our physical space, we have constructed our office to meet our needs. We have a banister that runs the length of the main hallway in our office. Our doorways are quite wide so that people who use wheelchairs are able to get in and out of the offices. And in the pre-COVID days, as soon as you walked in our door, you would actually see to your right where attendants would sit. So attendants are people who support people with physical disabilities with activities of daily living. And my organization, SILT, and this happened before I got there, but SILT actually has on staff attendants who were there to provide that kind of support to staff and to anybody who came into our space that required attendant support. So you could physically see evidence of accommodations in our space as soon as you came in to SILT. So I think that that had a lot to do with building a kind of culture of accommodation in terms of, the visibility of accommodations was very clear when you came into our office. We do also have formal elements of our accommodation process. So we have dedicated funding that year over year is in our budget that is just there for accommodations. We also have an element of our reserve fund that specifically states in our bylaws that this chunk of reserve fund can also be used for accommodations for whoever requires it in the event that we can't fund the funds from operational funds. We make it a priority to make sure that there are operational funds year over year in the budget for accommodations, but we also have this fallback of additional funding in the event that we need it. So that's part of the formal piece. Because we've kind of created this visibility, we talk about accommodations, many of our staff are accommodated. The process, I think, is perhaps less intimidating for folks to come to a manager and say, and we don't require any diagnosis, and we've been very clear about that. We've had emails that have gone around and said to people, you don't have to tell us what's wrong. That question that as a disabled person, I get a lot, what's wrong with you? You don't have to tell us that. You just need to indicate that there's a need for an accommodation. And that has largely been through discussion with management. So managers will hear from staff and there'll be a little bit of a chat. And then, I'll have a chat as well with the manager and, we'll come to some understanding of what will be provided, but usually it is what's asked for. So the range of accommodations that we have include things like, as I said, we have on staff when we're physically in the office, which I'm hoping will happen sometime in the next year. We have attendants on staff. The attendants support people with physical disabilities, as I said, with activities, daily living. We have places for people to rest in our office. So we actually have some staff who have a couch in their office. We have other staff who have brought in yoga mats if they need a rest during the day. These are the kinds of accommodations that are particularly important in my experience for people with episodic disabilities. So if fatigue is part of your disability, we've had conversations with people where they just say, look, like, I really want to be here. I want to do this work, but I need a bit of a rest mid-afternoon. And we said, okay, well, how do we do that? What can we do? So as I said, we have a couch, we have yoga mats. We've had people just kind of take over one of the unused office spaces and have a bit of a rest. So those are things that we do regularly. We have technology too. So Drag and Dictate is something that I use with carpal tunnel syndrome in one hand. I find it quite useful sometimes, but there are other staff members as well. Zoom text, we found Microsoft 360 is really important for us as well, because it provides a way for everybody to share things. People are not so worried about how do we collaborate, particularly remotely. So that's been good for us. We're also kind of in the practice of providing alternate formats because of the work that we do with the community, and because of who we are. We work very hard on making sure that alt formats are available to people. We always ask. And I think, again, coming back to that idea that disabled people themselves know what they need. We put out there often, just let us know what you need and we can figure it out. Flexible work hours is something that we do as well. Flexible breaks, again, in discussion with managers. If this is something that a staff member has needed, fine, let's work it out. We'll figure out how to make that happen. We also, in terms of just the specific formal things we allow a relatively high number of sick days to be carried forward. So we allow an accumulation of a great many sick days for folks. It is not something that resets every year. Sick days can be carried over to quite a high total number of days. And we do that consciously because we recognize that sick days can be a very important piece of people maintaining their own health and wellness. And also because we want it to be there as a bridge for people in the event that they are unwell and they have to go off on, whether it's EI sickness benefits or LTD, we allow for that bridge between being off and joining LTD so that people are not without income in that period. So we've done that very specifically and very consciously. I can talk more about specific accommodations later. But so those are some of the things that we do. And I can't really take credit for any of that. I have to be truthful. Most of that was in place when I got to SILT. And again, it comes from the grassroots, valuing disabled people and really seeing we can't do our work if we don't accommodate, so how do we do that right from the get-go? Accommodations is part of our culture, as I was saying. One of the other things that I wanted to speak to is that we have a human resources information system that we use now. And so in the way that you were saying, Rochelle, about people don't want to have to explain every time, so in terms of keeping that information about an accommodation that's agreed upon, it goes into the, what is the name of your company, Gloria? So Center for Independent Living in Toronto is the name of our organization. So we're an independent living center, and there are independent living centers across all of the provinces in Canada. And I think there's about 8 of them, 7 or 8 of them in Ontario. So, but just to say about the HRIS system, we can put information about an accommodation that has been agreed upon, no worries, agreed upon into our HRS system so that even if that individual moves to a different manager, that the information about just the agreement around what accommodation looks like is attached to the person. It's not something that they have to re-articulate. It's a way for managers to be able to engage with that without requiring the re-articulation need. So this is how we think about accommodations. We've also done training on episodic disabilities in specific. So to make sure that all of our staff understand that our understanding of disability includes episodic disability. We have done training with everyone to say, and here, I know everybody's really clear on what physical disabilities look like, particularly at our organization, but this is also considered to be a context for thinking about accommodation, that if you're living with an episodic disability, you're also entitled to accommodation. And if that's what you think you need in terms of your workday, then you can talk to us about it. So I just wanted to speak briefly to recommendations to other businesses. I think that it's really important, and I think we've heard this from some other folks today too, to know that disabled people themselves are the experts in what they need. And I think it's important to really be curious and genuine and authentic around exploring what someone is telling you would help and determining how the two of you can come to a place of agreement. But understanding that people want to work, they want to be engaged at work, and they, when they come to you with an accommodation request, they're saying, I need something else here to be engaged at work, and having an authentic conversation about that. It also demonstrates a clear commitment to everybody else. So whether or not you have staff that, likely we all have staff that have disabilities that have never said anything about it for whatever reason, and we don't require anybody to disclose anything, but this accommodation culture means that people are more likely to come forward and say, I think I I think I might need something, because they've seen other people be accommodated and not had any kind of, punitive or difficult, or, had their privacy infringed upon in that context. So it's kind of a pay it forward, I think, in terms of culture. Make sure that you have the policies and procedures in place for accommodation. And, it sounds very straightforward, but I don't know that everybody thinks consciously about the folks that you don't hear about. Having those policies there is a really important part, again, of making sure that people know it's okay to talk like this at work. Flexibility is a key, particularly around people with episodic disabilities. It's not so much the what, it's the how. How do we support you to do your work? Dedicated funding is a huge part in terms of recommendations for businesses. If you don't already have some kind of accommodation fund, and Rochelle, we heard from you talking about a centralized accommodation fund. And because we're small, again, a very different context, I can just set it aside in the budget. I don't know that everybody does that though. So if there's a way, if it's within your power to set aside money for that budget, then I would encourage you to do that, because it will signal to everybody around you that you take accommodation seriously too. Not only will you have been planning for the expenses, but you will indicate clearly that disabled people are important in terms of your workplace as well. And finally, I just wanted to say, I think remembering that accommodations can change is a critical part of this particular discussion that we're having around accommodating people with episodic disabilities. Having a check-in process, we have regular check-in with staff on goals. So we all set goals. Having a check-in as part of that process around accommodations, how are things going? Do we need to make any changes as part of how we manage the requirement for flexibility and potentially for change of accommodations? So these are some of the things that we do at the Center for Independent Living in Toronto. Again, just a very different context, I think, from both what Michael and Rochelle were talking about, but maybe as a smaller business, you could see in our case study, in our example, some of those additional spaces for flexibility around accommodations. But I have to say, just frankly, I don't think that there's been a situation where we've accommodated somebody and thought, oh, I wish we hadn't done that. I genuinely don't think that's happened. It has always been received well, and it's always been, it's always moved people forward. And without accommodations, without this kind of culture of accommodations, we just continue this cycle of keeping people with disabilities out of the workplace. And that just, continues this cycle of ongoing poverty. So there are much larger issues here at play as well. So that's it for me in terms of SILT and what I have learned and how we operate. I'm just looking at the time. So it is 2:12. I'd just like to open up to everybody. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please let me know. I think there might be a question here in the chat. And Melissa Egan, you said that you could also keep an eye on the chat for us.
I will, absolutely. Yep.
Thank you. And if folks wanted to, instead of putting in the chat, if you want to unmute and put your camera on, then you're welcome to do that too. So Adrian, I can see that you have a question. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for that. We do put money aside for accommodation. It's part, we call it our staff wellness fund. It's about $6,000 a year. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's helpful. The biggest conflict or problem I run into is other staff. When it comes to accommodating people, that accommodation is between me as their employer and them. And there's an expectation of confidentiality as to what's going on. But then there are staff members who rely on each other to complete projects or so forth. And I run into conflict there, and I don't know what I can and can't say sometimes. And I've actually had someone file a grievance against another employee, despite my trying to sort of wiggle around it to say, don't do this. It's because of, other reasons. And so any advice you can give me in terms of how to I I always encourage the people who ask for accommodation to be open with it with their colleagues if they're comfortable doing so, because it will explain absences, it will explain reduced hours, will explain various physical or emotional supports that are put in place. And so, but then when they don't, how do I navigate that with other people, or do I just not?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Adrian, and it's a question I've heard from other employers too. Speaking from the perspective of mine at SILT, it's not actually an issue that we run into because there is a kind of understanding because of the nature of our work and of our workforce that if somebody's sort of not there or they're taking extra time off or they're coming in a little bit later, it's almost an understanding that it is automatically an accommodation in our context. So we don't tend to have those kinds of conversations. But Rochelle and Michael, I wonder if either of you would like to respond to Adrian's question.
I think, sorry, I think in our case, we encourage them to would talk to their in the local situation. We have 60 odd locals that work with different the different school district. We would probably be encouraging that member to talk to their local president if they had a concern, who would likely be aware of the accommodation. And I know in terms of sharing that information, I totally understand what you're talking about. And in schools, one of the things that often will happen, especially if we have equipment accommodations, it can be very challenging because many of our schools are very, very old with very antiquated equipment. And suddenly someone walks by and sees this beautiful, amazing document reader and brand new equipment right in their school. And they're concerned about why they didn't get that. Why are they able to get that? And why am I not able to get that? And so we deal with some of that kind of equipment jealousy at times, but most of our teachers are pretty good at understanding there's a reason for this happening. And usually it's related to based on an accommodation and using maybe that piece of it, right? That it is an accommodation, not getting into the actual functionality or the diagnosis, but it's just there to help support them to be at work. So.
Thanks, Michael. Michelle.
I do agree with Michael, but there's a difference within the federal government, and I'm pretty sure it's that way everywhere. We're not allowed to speak, and we're not even supposed to know the diagnosis. So that brings us to, just having a request for accommodation or a doctor's note, but without the diagnosis. So that makes us not aware of the reason why the person is asking for that. But I know it's going to be a challenge for a long time until, our workplace will become fully inclusive and that accommodation will be part of the way forward, and that, people will know it's safe to do so and ask for accommodation, even if it's not for a disability, as I said earlier, if it was a single parent, with a commute. Because once people will go back to the office, some will ask for specific hours for the commute and going to get the kids from the garden and all of that. So I think it's really a subject. There's no right answer in that, as it's not for us as a manager to explain it. But as Michael said, just say it's an accommodation and not go further. Eventually hoping that all the employees will feel comfortable enough to speak about why they need it, to demystify what is a disability, and as Giselle said earlier, becoming a self-advocacy about the fact that person with disability have the right to work and they could do a good job providing they have the proper accommodation.
Thank you.
I'd just like to offer up just one small kind of suggestion here too, Adrian. Part of what can be done, and it relates strongly to what Wendy brings up about the culture of accommodation, is in a workplace environment to consistently mention it, to ask about accommodation, and to, at staff meetings, remind folks, and to make it so that this language and this kind of way of working is baked in. And so some of those grievances, some of that like disparity concern, and I don't get that, I don't get a 2-hour lunch break, these kinds of things come up a little bit less when accommodation is part of the language and culture of your organization. So it's that piece that Rachel is talking about, but it's a little bit, you kind of have to get heavy-handed with it in the beginning.
Yeah, thank you for that. But I'm actually an AIDS committee of Durham region, so many of my staff are PHAs, myself included, and so episodic disability is part of our everyday work, and accommodation is spoken about frequently and often, and annual reviews and supervision meetings, I make a point to bring it up as well. So I do appreciate everything you've said there, and we are doing that, but still, people being people,
yep.
You never know what's going to set somebody off.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, it's a really tough one from a leadership perspective too, Adrian, just that, some of this is about fairness, right? Some of this is a question of fairness. And, for me, that might also be a question that you would want to be thinking about in the context of staff and leadership. Like, do staff trust that leadership is making decisions that are fair? And that might be another question to ask in this context, but it is complicated. So thank you very much for your question. Dennis, I can see that you have your hand up. Would you like to go ahead and ask a question?
Sure. I'm just wanting to know if there's any tips on how do you approach an employer to seek accommodation without making it sound like you're just out there trying to get preferential treatment? And do you have to disclose your diagnosis to them, or whatever the situation is?
Yeah, you don't have to disclose your diagnosis under any circumstances. So, but you do have to indicate a need for an accommodation in that kind of request. Your question is again about this idea of there being kind of preferential treatment too. So I wonder, Rachel or Michael or Melissa, does anybody want to speak to Dennis's question?
Dennis, if I can, yes, Giselle here, just to volunteer an option. What was important for me was to go to my doctor and get a certificate saying that I require XYZ to do my job, effectively. So with that, now that was the certified backup or backing of the need for the accommodation. So maybe you can think about that. And the doctor does not have to disclose why, but once it's from a medical practitioner, that would help substantiate your request.
Yeah, that's a great
Putting
point. Thank you, Giselle.
Functional limitations rather than diagnosis, right? That kind of language, making sure that your physician provides information about the things that you might need in order to be successful in that particular task of your job, rather than Dennis is living with blank and he needs these things, right? As opposed to, just like these are things that would support his success at work. And so disclosure is not necessary. But as Rachel keeps reminding us, and we begin to get a little bit more comfortable with discussing disability and talking about the things that we are living with, the decision to disclose is one that you can make on your own after you kind of figure out what that culture is like, but it's also something that might be possible at some stage. I just want to make sure that we have a look at the chat too, Tammy.
Sure.
Wendy, there are a couple of questions in there. And I want to offer up to folks for the last few minutes that if anyone has any questions for Giselle, she's also available to chat with us too.
Thank you, Giselle, and thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Melissa.
I can see there's a few questions in the chat. So there's a question here. I think it was for you, Rachel, around the passports, the accessibility passports.
Yeah.
And the question is, are there any concerns about privacy in the context of those passports being viewed by multiple people? Could you speak to that, do you think?
Yes, of course. Well, we're still in the government is still in the process, and I opened one. I saw the question, so I opened one to make sure I have the proper information. Again, there is no information about diagnosis in there. The biggest question we're asking is, what do you need to best do your job? So, what will help you, best do your employment, and have you done it before? Does it work? So it's mostly that. There's other questions. I'm simplifying. So by doing that, there's no personal information per se that will be provided, but in the same document, there's a place for manager to say what they did and how they applied it. So the only person that will have access to that throughout your career is yourself and the manager that you will have. If you never change, well, it's the government, it always changes. But, the idea is it's restricted to a certain number of person, and you can also share it to, your accessibility office, or when you ask for accommodation, you can provide that information to them. But the person with disability is the owner of that document. So she's the person, or he or she is the person who will decide to whom she will share it with. So doing it that way and on a specific server that is really restricted will make sure that it simplifies and makes it more, safe to have the information. But again, there's nothing about, what's the reason why you need that. And that is very important for us in the government. It's not, we don't divulge. You can if you want, but not in that document.
Thanks, Rochelle. There is another question here I can see in the chat around, okay, so if an employer is concerned about an employee's health situation, struggling to complete work tasks, duties, responsibilities, how can the employer broach health concerns and wanting the employee to seek medical support? And this is a really tricky question. Michael, would you like to speak to this one at all? Do you have any thoughts here?
Sure. I'll just go kind of, and again, I don't want to claim to be an expert on this, but I believe from an employer perspective, if they feel a person is struggling at work, they have what is called something to a duty to inform. So, so they have the ability to have a conversation with the employee to talk about a performance piece. Now, that performance piece may be due to something that is medically related. So then it would really be on the employee to go and talk to their doctor and see what information they can provide, doctor, occupational therapist, whoever it might be, to help provide information and support on, saying that they are struggling at work and what supports can be put in place so that could not wouldn't occur in the future.
Yeah, for us, yeah. So we operate with a kind of duty to inquire. Somebody's just put that in there too. So I think it's essentially the same thing. But what we as employers can do is we can comment on things we can see. So the way that we might have that conversation is to say, I've noticed that it has been difficult lately in terms of your start time. I've noticed that there are some challenges in terms of completing XYZ. These are some of the things that I can see that I've noticed. We are dedicated to providing accommodations to people in the event that you need an accommodation to be able to be successful at your job. And we have a process for that. And I just, I'd like to put that on the table for folks. But it is challenging because you cannot require somebody to disclose something that they don't want to disclose. So you can be in a situation where, unfortunately, even if you are proactive, and we try to be proactive about that it can start to look like a performance issue when it's not. It's somebody who's really struggling with a changing set of circumstances or an episodic disability. And, then if without the acknowledgement of a need for accommodation, it can be hard to progress. Maybe there are things that you can agree to individually with that person that doesn't formalize it as an accommodation, but still meets their needs. And that would be a strategy too, I would say, is to say, you know what, it seems like things are tough, and you put out the accommodation piece and they don't want to talk about it in that context. but maybe it could be a, I wonder about you starting a little bit later. Maybe that would be helpful for you. Like, could we try that out for a little while? So, I would probably try to be creative that way around those conversations. But it is a tricky one. Does anybody else have anything you'd like to add? Giselle, Rochelle, or Melissa?
Sure, and not necessarily in technique, but just the point that inquiry by the employer is huge, because it immediately puts the subordinates at ease to know, okay, this is an open and accepting employer, and especially it encourages the environment of trust. And to promote disclosure as well. And just in my situation as well, disclosure not only lifted the burden off of me, but it also allowed some of my colleagues to come to me with their issues, even senior people. So it creates that environment of trust and disclosure, which you want in order to address the issues.
Thanks, Giselle. I'm just looking at the time. We are at 2:30, right on the button. I see that there's a few other questions here. Maybe what I could suggest, Melissa, is that I certainly would be open to having any questions kind of sent on. Rochelle and Michael, if there's anything that anybody wants to follow up with us on, would you be okay with that? And Giselle as well? Okay, great. So, and Sandy, I see your hand up there, but I think we unfortunately have to move on. So I just want to thank all of the presenters today. Thank you, Rochelle. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Giselle, as well, for stepping in and answering some questions too. And big thanks to Realize for all of this work and for facilitating this important discussion. I think the number of questions that you see is because we're all still grappling with this. I take heart from the fact that we are thinking about it. We're really thinking deeply about this and how do we do this well so that we can make sure that people with episodic disabilities, just like everybody else, can show up to work and succeed. So thank you very much, Realize, and thanks everybody. And a special thank you to Rochelle and Michael for being here as well. So thank you.
Stay safe.
Yes, and you too.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Wendy, Rachel, Mike, and Giselle.